All right. This is our lecture on Chapter 16, where we are going to explore the psychosocial constraints in motor development. Back at the beginning of this semester, we said that individual functional constraints, right, were constraints that were not anatomically related to an individual. So it could include their emotions, their motivation, their perceived ability, all things that we have continued to talk about throughout the semester. Okay, so Chapter 15 discusses social and cultural constraints as they relate to individuals and the environment. Chapter 16 is going to explain another area of individual functional constraints by looking at the psychology of an individual and how psychological beliefs are influenced by social constructs. And we'll talk about how cognition is influenced by some of the social and cultural constraints that we previously talked about in Chapter 15. Okay, so primarily the goal of this chapter is to explore how psychosocial constraints affect participation in physical activities and therefore how they influence a person's motor development. I think a huge thing psychologically that we have to discuss when we are talking about psychosocial constraints or cognition, psychology, is self-esteem. And so first we need to define what is self-esteem. In our lectures, we'll refer to this as SE. So anytime you see that abbreviation, it's referring to self-esteem. Okay, but it's a person's judgment of their capability, their significance, their success, and their worthiness. And it can be general in terms of their overall sense of worth as a human being, but it could also be specific, right? A person could have a really good general self-esteem, but they might have issues with or lower areas of specific self-esteem. Maybe it's too or geared towards their physical appearance. Their abilities to perform certain tasks could be academic ability, it could be their social status, right? A lot of different things. But self-esteem is going to influence a person's motivation to join and sustain particular physical activities. So again, we're pointing to this idea of motor competence. And having greater motor competence is going to encourage people to participate more in physical activity. So childhood is going to probably be the most influential period for kind of developing an overall sense and specific senses of self-esteem, because there's a lot of new experiences and a variety of experiences being introduced at this stage of the lifespan. So childhood physical competence can be influenced by a person's degree of intrinsic motivation. Okay, so we kind of hinted at this last time, and I didn't want to go too far into it in the last lecture because I knew we were going to touch on it in this one. So in the last lecture, we said there is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is where you are self-seeking improvement. Okay, so you're or you could also say you're self-motivated to try to do well, but people who have higher intrinsic motivation, usually that motivation is going to acknowledge a person's existing competence, and then it's going to pair with the belief that any existing incompetencies can be overcome. Right? So there's a desire to prove competency, there's a desire to improve just in terms of self-improvement because you yourself want to do it, right? This is opposite from a person who is extrinsically motivated, where, like, perfect examples. I swear my sister and I are the perfect examples for motor development. I'm a very intrinsically motivated person. I will engage in lots and lots and lots of activities just for the sake of making myself better. My sister, on the other hand, will not unless there is a reward at the end. And that is the extrinsic motivation, right? As a kid, if she didn't get a trophy or if she didn't do well, she was like, I'm not doing this anymore because I'm not good, because I didn't win the trophy. She didn't have that extrinsic validation of her competence. So usually we say that childhood physical competence is going to be mostly influenced by a person's degree of intrinsic motivation. The higher their intrinsic motivation, the more competent they're going to feel about themselves, and the more competent they will probably end up being, because there's that internal drive to be better. It also could be competence in general could be influenced by self-authority. So this is looking at how much power or authority a person has over their abilities. The more a person believes that they have control over their development of certain abilities or certain skills, the more physically competent they're probably going to feel. So you guys can think about this in any walk of life. It doesn't have to be, motor development or development of self-esteem. But in general, usually the more control you have over your life, the more hopeful you feel, right? And typically on the flip side, right, if everything is going wrong and you feel like you have no control of anything that's going on, the more helpless you feel, right? And so I think this pandemic offers us a very wonderful perspective on self-authority, because there were a lot of limitations to things that were, they were put on us that were just completely out of our control. And so how do we cope with that? And how confident do we feel about ourselves moving forward based on that lack of control? So self-authority is going to play a huge role in a person's development of self-esteem or their physical competence in certain activities. Okay. I do want to mention this last note here, that the accuracy of perceived ability is going to increase with age. Okay. So the things that we're mentioning here, a person's degree of intrinsic motivation or their self-authority, in terms of like how do they believe, or how do they view their competency, and how do they want to improve upon that competency, those views are not always accurate, right? So accuracy is the equality of a person's perceived abilities or worth with their actual abilities and worth. And if people have incorrect personal evaluation of competence, that can skew their belief further away from the level of actual competence that they're at. So I like to use Nemo. I think I have an example of Nemo on the next slide too, but it's his lucky fin. His dad constantly says like, ooh, like we need to protect you from the world because you didn't develop normally and you have a handicap, or you have a disability of some sort, right? Because you are different than other people. And Nemo is just like, it's my lucky fin though, like it helps me swim better. And he truly believes that he can swim like other fish despite his deformation, right? And so, while we see the movie, and I mean, it's Pixar, it's animation, it's Disney, right? But we see him like swimming. It doesn't seem like he swims any different from other people, but there is a possibility, like, oh, well, I can swim like other fish because it's my lucky fin. It helps me swim better. But if it actually doesn't, right, lining up what is perceived versus what is reality and making sure that those two things agree with each other is also important. Another example are kids who think that they are superheroes or model superhero behaviors, and if they keep modeling those behaviors, eventually they think like, I have this superpower. And I want to say there was a movie series with Samuel L. Jackson, Bruce Willis, and James McCoy. It was like Glass, Fracture. They were really interesting names, but one of the individuals in that movie series thought that he was a superhero, if I'm remembering correctly. And so, I don't know, but I just thought of that. But, people who think like, I can do things. I have a friend on Facebook who has a kid, and she was like, I'm gonna do a backflip. And then she just like falls backwards on a bed. It was so funny, but she was like, look how good I did. And her mom was just like, that was good. And I think there's a fine line between like encouraging people, but then also falsely encouraging people. So it's not always just an individual process in terms of like, I have this perceived ability about myself and I like this is what reality actually is. Sometimes it's not always just an individual perspective. It could be people falsely saying like, you are really great at this, just in efforts to not hurt people's feelings. So that it could be a hindrance in some ways. But validation from other people as well as validation from yourself are two things that are going to play into your development of self-esteem, and your accuracy of your abilities do increase with age. So usually if kids are like, I can do this so great, we usually just go along with it, and then we kind of guide them into harsher criticisms and harsher realizations of reality as they get older, so that this accuracy does improve. In terms of social interactions, I started to kind of lead into this, but significant others, right? Our parents, teachers, coaches, peers, family members, siblings, etc., right? Our self-esteem is going to be influenced by evaluations from those people. Okay, so parental appraisal is most critical through age 10. Right, having a parent say, you did a good job, you did a bad job, you could have done better, right? And that's where I think, my example of Nemo comes in, because he was like, I can do this, I am competent. And his father is always saying, you can't do this, like you are different, right? So that parental appraisal is going to foster different feelings within an individual and could potentially affect how somebody engages with certain activities. Peer appraisal, however, is going to be more critical after age 10. So again, when we get into that early adolescent period where having a social life with friends and being involved in peer groups or being involved in athletic teams is going to be more popular, right, or more prevalent at ages greater than 10. So peer appraisal is going to have a larger influence than parental appraisal once we get into that adolescent period. However, I had a caveat that people like myself who participated in more individual-based activities, parental appraisal is still going to have a big influence on how you perform in certain things. I just think once you get to age 10, you're more engaged with social activities, right? So peers start to have more influence after age 10. Parents, most critical through age 10, but they can still have persistent influence after. I mean, and even still, like most of you, like being in college might still be afraid to say like, Mom, I got a bad grade in a class, So we still value their opinions, and those will have effect on our perceptions of ourselves. Sex differences in responses to feedback and criticism. Males tend to respond to praise for actions done well. Females tend to respond better to feedback that suggests improvement, which I think this is something that we introduce in Kin 312 in motor control and motor learning, when you start to talk about types of feedback and how you give feedback to different types of people. But these are just the findings that are like gendered in terms of how people respond. And so it's a little bit conflicting with some of the stuff that we introduced in the previous lecture, where we're like, oh, you have to be a little bit gentler with females sometimes, and how like they need more validation, I guess, in certain scenarios, just because of how society surrounds their role in certain things. But usually if you format feedback in a way that's like, I think you could do this to be better, right? They're gonna respond better to that than just being told like, you did great. It also depends on personal, like individuality in terms of like people's personalities. But in general, research has shown that males respond better to positive feedback, females respond better to suggestive criticism or constructive criticism. Emotions are also going to play a role in the development of self-esteem. So higher levels of self-esteem are usually going to be associated with enjoyment and excitement in participating in physical activity. Lower levels are going to be associated with opposite emotions, such as disappointment, stress, or anxiety. Okay, so emotions are going to be associated with success or failure. So if you do really well, that's why I have this picture of this coach like giving this girl a hug. It could be her mom, I don't really know, right? But if you have an emotional response either from within yourself or from a supportive figure, such as a coach or a parent or family members, and they link a certain emotion with success or failure, you are likely to adopt that similar emotion. So, usually, individuals who have high perception of ability, low parental pressure, and greater parent or coach satisfaction are going to have greater enjoyment associated with the physical activity. With dancing, I did that as pure enjoyment. I always got positive feedback from my mom saying, like, oh, you're doing great. That was a lot better than last week, you know? And then, so low parental pressure in terms of like doing the activity. I did it because I wanted to. I think I had high perceptions of ability just because dance was something I picked up on pretty quickly, and I was able to compare myself to other people, which, by the way, people are able to compare themselves to others as early as age 5. Okay, so we start making these, or we start kind of developing our perceptions of our abilities in comparison to other people as early as age 5. So I was able to look at others in my dance classes and say, like, well, I think that my movement modeled the teacher's movement a lot better than that other person, right? And so I had a high perception of ability. I had low parental pressure from my mom to participate in dance. And then on the flip side, I didn't always have great teacher satisfaction. So I think there were several times in my dance career or dance participation that my teacher almost made me quit dance because if she was having a bad day, she would like take it out on us. She would be mean to us, telling me that I needed to lose weight, that I was fat when I was not. You know, like other times she'd be like, wow, Nat, that was so great. Like, you've been putting in a lot of hard work and you've been doing well. And like, I'm just really pleased with your performance, that type of thing. So it was a give or take. And I think this was the part that was like the coach satisfaction. It was the hardest thing to kind of balance out the enjoyment part because there were some times where I was like, do I just even want to do this anymore because I'm getting ridiculed in class? Like, is it worth it? Right? But emotions are going to play into your self-esteem, which is going to play into your perceived competence, right? Which is going to play into if you are going to participate with an activity. Because as soon as you have a negative association, that's where we start to like the potential for, you know, like aversive behaviors and trying to like retract away from participation. So the more encouragement we have, the better, but also balancing again encouragement with reality. So telling people like, yeah, maybe you didn't do so great today, but you'll do better next time. You know, kind of sandwiching positive feedback and criticism is never a bad thing. But the emotions that we attach to certain activities are definitely going to have a role in how we interact with that particular activity in the future.